Everyone says you have to forgive in order to heal, but is that really true? Is forgiveness really necessary for healing? Find out on today's episode of the Joker the King podcast. What's good, Joker the King community? Welcome to another episode of the Joker the King podcast. I hope you are enjoying June. This is Men's Mental Health Month. And today we're going to have a special episode. If you have been a fan of Joker the King for a while, you know that we've talked about forgiveness before. There's a chapter on how to forgive your parents in the Joker the King book. But today I'm going to pose a different kind of question to you. Is forgiveness actually necessary to heal childhood trauma or old wounds? Is forgiveness actually necessary for your healing journey? So let's get started. My parents, they met in high school. My father was a year older than my mother, and near the start of her spring semester of senior year, she was pregnant with me. And by the time my mother was 21, she was a mother of two sons, trying to make ends meet. My parents eventually divorced when I was very, very young. Despite my father's alcoholism and his absence, despite my mother yelling and her behavior at me, despite all that stuff, my childhood was still relatively stable and good. I was raised by a single mom who figured out pretty quickly how to make everything work. She was street smart, a quick thinker, very social, very talkative, very action oriented. Eventually, I learned to forgive my parents because my parents were teenagers. They were teenagers when they had me, and no one could expect them to know what being a good parent really meant when they were busy trying to figure out what being an adult really meant. And I realized that they did the best they could with the tools and resources and knowledge and energy and the lessons that were available to them at the time. And I learned how to forgive my parents. So years later, when I published my book, Joker the King, I included a chapter for everybody on how to forgive their parents. And my intent was to teach you all how to incorporate forgiveness into your journey to healthy adulthood. However, about 2 months ago, something happened that made me rethink my stance on forgiveness. It was with my college students. This semester, I decided to take my English 101 students through this forgiveness activity that I wrote about in Joker the King. I gave them all an assignment. They had to forgive their parents or guardians in actual face-to-face conversations, and then they had to turn in a written reflection on this whole experience. If one or more of their parents were not alive or available, then students could forgive their parents in the form of a letter to each parent. And the students kind of anticipated that these conversations would be difficult, but almost all of them agreed to do the assignment. Now, I work in San Bernardino, and many students in San Bernardino had rough childhoods, but most of them planned out their thoughts beforehand. They practiced their forgiveness conversations. Some students who were raised by awesome, healthy parents couldn't find anything to forgive their parents for, so they asked their parents a different question. They talked to their parents about what they wish they would have done differently in raising their children. And it was a great assignment, and all the students did well overall. But one student in particular said she just could not have any of these conversations with her family. She insisted that there was no way she could ever forgive her parents, even in the form of a written letter. She told me about the abuse of her childhood. She told me about the neglect in her childhood. She explained about the violence in her childhood. She explained that, see, she was the daughter of parents who were gangbangers and violent thieves, right? Her parents were the second or third generation in a family tree of drug dealers. And there was no forgiveness to be found within this student of mine. Now, as a coincidence, a few days later, this topic of forgiveness came up again. I was interviewed as a guest on a news program to discuss the death of Carolyn Bryant, the white woman in Mississippi in 1955, whose allegation led to the brutal murder of Emmett Till. During this interview that I was on, the host asked me what I thought about Emmett Till's cousin forgiving Carolyn Bryant. And it was then that I realized that forgiveness is a lot trickier than I thought. I thought about my student. I thought about my student's trauma and how she felt pressured to forgive her parents before she was ready. I thought about Black families who refused to forgive white officers who killed their loved ones. I thought about all the debates about Black forgiveness being a tool to ease white guilt. I thought about the fact that not one white person ever talked about forgiving Al Qaeda after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. So all these things were going through my mind about why people forgive and why people do not forgive. So I did a quick internet search to see what psychologists felt about this whole idea of forgiveness being a part of the healing journey, and found some interesting things. What I've come to understand is that forgiveness should not be thought of as a necessary part of healing, but it should be thought of as an option. Because sometimes forgiveness may actually not be a good idea. There are some times when asking someone to forgive people who did them wrong, there are times when that request to forgive is actually doing more hurt than good. Let me give you an example. First, telling a victim of a traumatic experience that they will never truly heal without forgiveness is a terrible thing to do because it creates this double victimization. Why tell someone who is already a victim that they must act as the peacemaker, or else they'll have a lifetime of perpetual suffering because they refuse to forgive? Not only are they a victim of that traumatic experience, but now they become a victim of their own suffering because they have to be the peacemaker and choose not to. Second, forgiveness is actually a relational concept. There's a psychologist named Dr. Diane Pomerantz, and she wrote that forgiveness implies that the forgiver and the forgiven take a journey together to reach conciliation. Genuine forgiveness involves more than just one person. She wrote, therefore, it makes no logical sense to consider forgiveness unless both parties are involved in the transaction. That explains some of the results with my college students. Most of my students who had actual forgiveness conversations with their parents reflected on how well it went and how good everyone felt, but it was only because those parents were willing participants. They were willing participants in the conversation. They were willing to acknowledge some of the harm, either intentional or unintentional, that was caused toward their children. They were willing participants in the forgiveness transaction. The third reason why sometimes forgiveness may not be a good idea is because relationships are complex, they are nuanced, but trauma is also complex and nuanced. There's another licensed therapist named Bren Chase who wrote, "It is simply inappropriate to generalize and apply a forgiveness model evenly across the board to all relationships." Not all transgressions are created equal. The therapist said, and I quote, for example, I may be able to forgive a close friend who lied to me, but find myself unwilling or unable to forgive that same friend if they were to assault me. See, a one size fits all approach to healing doesn't work. More specifically, the forgiveness model, when you apply all across all domains, is fundamentally flawed because it doesn't account for context, attachment style, cultural implications, personal values, organic individual differences, past experiences, trauma exposure, the depth of the transgression, the breadth of the transgression. So I was thinking back to my students. I realize now that I may have caused more harm than I originally thought for that one student who refused to forgive her parents. I incorrectly assumed that she would benefit from sharing space with the actual people who abused her. Let me say that again. I incorrectly assumed that she would benefit from sharing space with the people who abused her. I incorrectly assumed that I had the solution to accelerate her healing. I incorrectly assumed that her personal journey was up to me instead of up to her. And this student was a first-year student. She's thoughtful, smart, compassionate. But shortly after that forgiveness assignment, she left the class and never returned. And my own guilt compels me to reach out to her and find her and ask for forgiveness. And I hope she does forgive me, but I understand if she chooses not to. All right. That's it for today's episode. No action item, just a lot to contemplate and think about. I want you to take care of yourself, and while you're at it, take care of someone else. Peace.